taking the world they know and turning it into fiction. With me today are Sandra Barret, Alaina Erdell, DC Robeline, and Brey Willows. You will notice that Ali isn't here with us. Ali Valley was supposed to be here. Something came up. So I'm just going to expect the other four to be twice as fabulous to compensate. So no pressure. Before we begin, a quick reminder, if you can set your screen to gallery view so you can see all of our faces. And the chat roll is absolutely there. By all means, have a great conversation. But if you have questions, please do me a favor and pop them into the little Q&A box, which is at the bottom in the middle. That way, if I do have time at the end of this, I will be able to see your questions on the chat roll. They just stream on by, and I probably won't catch them as they go by. So I'm going to start by introducing our wonderful authors, and then I'm going to ask each of them in turn to tell us a little bit about the world or worlds they've written, and what's the biggest difference between the real world and their fictional one, and then we'll dive into some more specific questions. So I'm going to start with Sandra. Sandra Barret is a native New Englander who wanted to be an archaeologist. So of course, she ended up a writer for a software company. She focuses her fiction writing on urban fantasy and science fiction stories where strong women save the day. When not writing, she's reading, gardening, and occasionally digging holes way too deep in the back of a historic farm in the hopes of finding something more archaeologically significant than the ever-present coal slag. Dreams never die, they just adapt to life circumstances. So Sandra, tell us quickly about one of your worlds and what's different between, or the biggest difference between your real world and your fictional one.
Okay, so the Jade Murphy Diaries is a series that is set in the real world, set in Boston, but involves, for the majority, involves vampires. And so that's kind of the biggest difference. There are some other supernatural type creatures mentioned here and there, but the biggest difference would be, yeah, I've got vampires.
Awesome. Alaina Erdell released her debut novel, Fire, Water, and Rock, with Bold Strokes Books last month. Does anyone else find that a tongue twister every single time?
Yes.
Bold Strokes Books last month, and has a second book due out in March, because heaven forbid you slow down. She's an avid reader and reads over 100 books a year. When not reading or writing, she enjoys cooking, traveling, oil painting, and being anywhere near the ocean. How about you, Alaina? What's your world versus the real world? What's the difference?
Well, my first book, I set it in a state park, and it's an unusual state park. It has one of what they think is the largest waterfall that ever, was on the planet. It's dry now, so everything was centered around that. And while I kept true to most things in terms of locations and everything, I also, if I need to fit something in, I'm okay making up something. I mean, that's what fiction is. So, if I need a little restaurant there that doesn't exist, I'm willing to put that in.
Nice. There was a panel I was on once called Making a Left Turn on Bourbon Street, I think it was, and you're not allowed to make turns on Bourbon Street or something like that. And people were talking about things that they had done just because they absolutely needed it to happen for the plot. Yeah. Next, we have DC Robeline, or David Robeline, is an accidental novelist and former journalist who took up writing fiction on a dare from his partner of more than 3 decades. Topics of interest to him include economic, social, and class underdogs, public corruption, individual fidelity and responsibility, and the many different faces and characters of love. He writes suspenseful novels featuring strong LGBTQ characters fighting for justice in engaging locations. After spending most of his life in the Washington, D.C. area, Robeline and his husband moved in late 2022 to Valencia, Spain, where he spends his time improving his Spanish, cooking traditional Spanish dishes, and walking everywhere since the family has no car. Welcome, DC. Why don't you tell us about the biggest difference between the world you created and the world you live in? Oh, you're muted, DC.
Guys, zoom. The world I created is a medium-sized city on the Georgia coast, about halfway between Jacksonville, Florida, and Savannah, Georgia. My parents, my mother and stepfather live in near Jacksonville and St. Augustine, Florida, and I've made the trip driving from Jacksonville area to Savannah several times. It's a wonderfully romantic, low, swampy, mysterious sort of landscape. I've always often loved it, and I decided to put my city there just because I needed a place. I wanted a place that was coastal. My city's different from where I live in that it's kind of ideal. It's in the sense that it's a city that I created because I want it to be that way. So, for example, I mean, my first novel, A Champion for Tinker Creek, when BSB bought the manuscript, they told me right away that it was probably 50,000 words too long. And the big part of that was because I can't make this work. The big part of that was because I put a lot of detail in about the town of St. Michael's Harbor and the neighborhood of Tinker Creek and the institutions it has and how it works and all that kind of stuff. All of it wonderful, none of it necessary to the novel. So that's the biggest difference. It's a world I create. It's the world as I would have it if I could, if I was, king or God or whatever. Thank you.
Nice. I think especially for those of us who write in the genre, now you all write in various genres, the whole notion of building the world the way we'd like it to be. I can't remember the last time I read a book from Bold Strokes where there wasn't justice of some kind. And I think that's definitely when you gather queer authors, there's that. I think one of the biggest things that I see over and over again is there's justice. People get what they deserve in the good way, as well as perhaps in the more punishment way. But and last but not least, our muse who amuses, Brey Willows. Brey Willows is a longtime editor and writer. Her passion is literature and the classics, and she's published a handful of short stories. When she's not running a social enterprise working with marginalized communities on writing projects, she's editing other people's writing or doing her own. She lives in the middle of England with her partner and her fellow author, and spends entirely too much time exploring castles and ancient ruins while bemoaning the rain. And I mean, I know the answer to this question already, but please tell us the difference between the real world and the worlds you're writing.
There are subtle ones, yeah. I write urban fantasy and science fiction and some dystopian stuff, but the primary difference is that we do not, in fact, have gods walking around among us, at least visibly. We don't know, but as far as we're aware, they're not actually around yet. But for me, it's very much the world we know and populating it with the unknown.
Right. Lovely. So actually, I'm gonna actually jump into the urban fantasy pair first, and then I will dive into the more. It's kind of a nice divide. We have people who are in the very urban fantasy here, and then we have people who are a little bit closer to reality. And so it'll be nice to get your opinions on this. But I'm going to start on the urban fantasy side. So Sandra, vampires. This is a well-known trope. They come with backloaded with so much lore. How much did you rely on what had already come before, and how much did you decide to throw out the window and sort of build on your own?
Well, I tried to kind of hit a combination of both, because like you said, it's vampires. People know vampires. They've known them for, read stories, watched movies or whatever. So it was important to me to keep some aspect of that, but I wanted it to be different kind of vampires. So Jade Murphy, the main character in this series of novellas, is what I call a working class vampire. She's working in a warehouse that looks remarkably like an Amazon warehouse without saying that. And then eventually she ends up on a night shift at a gas station. I mean, she is trying to make a living. Other things that I kind of took from the original lore and adapted is the whole sunlight thing. I mean, a lot of vampire stories, well, most of them sunlight kills, some of them it makes them sparkly, but we won't go there. So what I decided is that I wanted them to be able to live as much in our world as possible. So the sunlight in my stories makes them very sick, but it doesn't kill them. But it does lead into the trope in the sense that they're mostly out at night, because why would you be out in the day if you got to, makes you sick, like you're drunk too much and you're puking and everything else. So those were two of the big changes. I did keep things like the holy water, crossed, blessed items definitely can hurt or kill them. Something like a generic wooden stake, it's just going to hurt and make them mad. They do still have the ability to heal quickly. Their blood can heal other people. So there's a lot of things like that in there. But kind of one of the other things that I put in there that's kind of slowly evolving in the series is this idea that they're not actually immortal. They just age a whole lot slower. So, Jade is 150 human years old, but looks to be in her mid-30s. Because for every 10 human years, a vampire ages about a year or so. So those are kind of the big things. And then the fact that she's working class kind of leads into, if you are in the modern world, how do you deal with, the fact that you have to change your identity all the time? Because you can't, you're not aging, so you have to leave wherever you were and eventually change your name. And, keeping wealth is very difficult in that. So that's kind of why she's just working for a living.
Nice. I love the idea of this immortal vampire who's like, oh, I got to do my taxes and I need new ID. And just, because that's the world we live in now, right?
Yes.
That's awesome. I can't help it. I want to bring up like the giant biker, but I'm gonna make Brey do it. So okay, same question to you, Brey. You have taken muses and immortals and then dropped them into our world. What did you feel free to change? What did you want to change? And like, how beholden do you feel to the rules?
I think one of the nice things about what I did, particularly with the Afterlife trilogy and the muses, is there really weren't any rules. It hasn't been hugely done. And the ones that have done it, like, Penelope at by Margaret Atwood and things, they're such in a different league from what I'm doing that it doesn't really apply. So fortunately there weren't a lot of rules. I think the one thing I had to be really conscious of was getting it right. If I say this god is with this religion and he has blue skin and wears these kinds of flowers, I need that to be true. So it took a lot of research, lots and lots of Google imaging to find out, especially, the Hindu gods, there are so many of them. And when you think about, like you say, giant biker gods, and, would Prometheus be on a bike? Yeah, but it would have to be custom made because he's a Titan and he's huge. So, there's things that you have, there's like logical things that you have to consider. Would the elephant god blow bubbles with his trunk? I don't know. Is he a free happy god, or is he a serious god? So things like that are fun to play with, but making sure that I've also got kind of the finer details right.
Right. What's that word? Is it, I'm never going to pronounce it correctly, verisimilitude, I think.
Yes.
Is the word.
Yeah. Verisimilitude. Yeah. Absolutely. 100%.
Like the idea that it doesn't, it's not that it makes sense. It just, it has its own self-contained normalcy or something that makes it feel like it makes sense. Yeah,
exactly. There are expectations there that you have to meet. Yeah. But if you can play with them and really make it crazy, I think it makes it more engaging too. Like Sandra was saying, changing some of the stuff around vampires that makes it more interesting because it is unusual.
All right, so let's go to something that's a little closer to the real world, even if they're in their own made-up towns or made-up places. DC, how much did you, like you mentioned already that you've set your place on a coast, you wanted it to be on a coast. So why did you want to create your own coastal city rather than a city that might already exist? What went into the decision to sort of build a whole new world?
I think in part because I didn't want to have to keep accounting for real life in the fiction. If you base your novel in a place that really exists, and a given time, then things actually happened at that place in that time that you might have to account for as part of your book. And I didn't want to be tied down to that. I liked that I could choose different things from different parts of cities that I'd visited. So when you're doing it your own city, you can take things from other places and graph them together. So for example, Tinker Creek, which is the working class blue collar neighborhood, which is the primary setting for a champion for Tinker Creek, I based that largely on Lincolnville, which is the predominantly working class and African American neighborhood of St. Augustine. Just like in St. Augustine, Tinker Creek is across the railroad tracks from the proper St. Michael's Harbor, and it was considered the worst ground. It was considered swampy, and nobody really wanted it. But because it's only 2 or 3 blocks back from the beach, from the dunes, it really also became a very high value piece of real estate. So a big thrust in a champion for Tinker Creek, a big storyline, is that a group of corrupt politicians and business leaders have conspired to try to steal the land from the Tinker Creek's residents in order to build high value condos. And they're trying to use eminent domain to do it. And so that structure of the town let me take that novel and take that storyline.
Nice. I love that even when we write fiction and make up our own world, the politicians are still the bad guys. It's just, it's like you want that verisimilitude we were talking about. Yeah, I could believe that politicians would try to ruin everything, right? Yeah. How about you, Alaina? You said already that you had this park, but you nudged it. How much did you nudge it? And did you go into that knowing you were going to do that, or was it something you had to do as you went?
I stayed pretty true to it. I mentioned that they go to a restaurant, and of course there's going to be restaurants in nearby towns. I don't think I got too specific on that, but the park itself, I stayed true to, although I do mention a cave that may or may not be there, but I won't comment anymore on that. But I knew that putting them in this world, I wanted it to be, by choosing that park, it meant different things to each one of them. The first main character, Claire, is a ranger there. She actually lives in the park. And then, in order to push the two women together, I needed a reason for the other one to be there. So I made her a geologist that's going to be working on her thesis this summer, for this summer to be in the park. So they mean different things to each one of them. For the ranger, the world she lives in, it was her calling. She felt a kinship to the park. It's her dream job. For the geologist, it offers unusual things that she can only find there because of the geological formations that created it. So I stayed pretty true to that.
Nice, very nice. I love the idea of your setting, sort of choosing the career of one of your characters in a way that's fascinating to me. And actually, I'm going to make a note about asking you all questions about where setting comes in your creative process. Because I know for a lot of people, they start with characters, others start with setting. So file that away. That's coming up. But I am going to stick with you because you mentioned something to me in the past about where you're getting ideas when you're writing in settings that are at least partly based on the real world. Like, how much of that comes from eavesdropping in public? How much of that comes from?
A lot of it does. I mean, I'm lucky enough to be someone who can write in many places, as long as, it's sort of a low roar. I can, whether it's a plane or an airport or a coffee shop or, I can write in those kind of places, and I end up eavesdropping without intending to. So I get a lot of ideas. You hear people talk and they talk in different ways, and you can tell where they're from. Or just a couple days ago, I was in a coffee shop and I was writing, and then I just caught a sentence, and one woman said to another one, and then the whole place smelled like dead deer. And I was like, I just missed like a great story. Like, why wasn't I listening before? So yeah, you hear great things.
Oh, that's awesome. How about you? Sorry, Sandra. You, I mean, you're writing these vampires and go, but where did the ideas come from? Like,
So for this series, it's kind of interesting because I actually got an email about 6 months ago congratulating me on my, I don't even know how many year anniversary of my live journal blog that I had kind of forgotten about, except for it wasn't my live journal blog, it was Jade Murphy's diary. So I had actually just had some fun ages ago. I'll be honest, venting my frustrations through, a vampire that gets the justice we were talking about earlier. And then recently I was just thinking about how do I want to bring her back, because she was very different back. She was much darker back then. I kind of wanted to bring her back, but I wanted, given the state of the world, I wanted something oddly a bit more lighthearted, even though it is a vampire tale. It keeps things up kind of the lighthearted vampire, if that makes sense. So that's kind of where it all originated. And then I just kind of morphed it from there, and just like any author, you decided what is it you're trying to convey in your story, and how does that work into those characters?
I think that is the first time I've ever heard the phrase uplifting vampire, and I love it. I think you should just like trademark that, market that. It's just a more uplifting vampires. Oh,
Yes.
That's so heartwarming.
Heartwarming vampire stories.
How about you, Brey? I feel like, I swear I haven't actually ever heard the story of where did the idea come from for your Muse series.
I think it was a natural follow-on from the Afterlife series, in dealing with kind of the big gods who orchestrate so much stuff and have so much to do, and then kind of coming down to that and saying, well, what would somebody who's more like us be like in this world? So like with Lines of Love with Eris, she is one of us. She's a DJ, she's jaded, she's given up on love, and for the Muse of Love to give up on love, that's pretty sad. So I think it was a natural progression from the Afterlife series. And with me being such a huge Greek mythology geek, I think there's always going to be something. So I think for me, and I like to travel, and so many of the places I go have such rich mythology histories and things that they can be anywhere doing anything. And wouldn't it be amazing to have, to go to the coffee shop and sit down with the Muse of Astronomy and talk about astronomy, so that connection, I think, is what I really found interesting about the Muses.
Oh, that's lovely. Yeah. I'm trying to picture what I would ask Cleo, like, how do you even inspire history? Like, how does that work?
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah. I mean, it raises a ton of questions that I can't deal with in every book, because and I know that at some point somebody's going to send me something and say, why this, and this, and I'm not going to have an answer. But yeah, I think, and I mean, the Afterlife series, I grew up in LA, and it's a background that just suits chaos.
Nice. How about you, DC? What sort of where did the spark come from for Tinder Creek?
That's a very good question. I'm sorry I'm holding up on it because nobody's asked that before. From the location, from the geography itself, that really put me in a mind for writing, thinking about that lay of the land, thinking about the landscape I see when I drive back and forth, when I've driven back and forth from Savannah to Jacksonville and vice versa. I think all of that sort of came together to make me want to put the city there.
Nice.
Anything that the big the Tinker Creek was my first novel, is my first novel, and in a lot of ways it was the proof of the actual proof I could do one. That was it. That was the whole point of Tinker Creek, was that I could actually write a novel and finish it. So anything that would help me write it, I tended to grab onto and pull into the story.
Nice. That actually leads into my very next question, so I'll stay right with you. Is where does your setting, and let's be honest, setting is a huge chunk of world building. Where does that come in your process? Is the world that you've created first? Is it later on? Like where do you begin, or where does world building fall, and your setting fall in your process?
Well, I think it's important to note that I deliberately chose to make the Tinker Creek series based on the town of St. Michael's Harbor, and it is a geographic series. It's not based on characters. And I did that because characters are always having problems in series, because after a while they age, circumstances change, et cetera, et cetera. Keeping a series based on a location will let me introduce other characters, different characters, new characters who happen to live in the same place, who might even know the previous characters or be associated with them somehow, but would, for example, the police detective in Tinker Creek and in the second novel, Yuletide Murder, is a character that he's just kicking and screaming to have his own story. So I'm probably gonna have to give in at some point pretty soon and bring him to the table. But that's the kind of thing you can do when you have a series based on place rather than a series based on characters.
I think I'm sure we've all read series where the same characters in the same book, and you're like, once you hit book 8 or 9 or 10, you're like, oh, come on, Miss Marple, how many people are going to drop dead, right? So yeah, I can definitely see your point there. Alaina, how about you? Where does setting tend to pop up on your to-do list when it comes to crafting a new book? Oh, you're muted.
She might be frozen.
Oh, yeah, you're muted. All right. I think we'll just I'll jump to you, Sandra, and then we'll get to Alaina again if we can get her back.
Sure. So for me, one of the first things I start up with when I'm thinking of a new story is I kind of start with a what if. So for the Jade Murphy Diaries, what if a vampire had to keep a real job? And kind of the next thing I do is decide what the characters are, because I really feel, to me, they're the most important part for me, is who is this person? Who was she involved with? And then, before I go any deeper than that. So I'm really at if I was writing a paragraph, I've gotten to the paragraph point of summarizing where I want to go. And then I dig into where do I want to set it. My prior stories were science fiction, so I could do anything I wanted. I'm really enjoying the paranormal area because I can pick something, whether I decide, the Jade stories are set in Boston, so that was easy. It exists, it's real. It's not too far from me. I'm familiar with it. So I can pick places there that Jade has a history with, that some of the scenes involve the remnants of the old shipbuilding industry in East Boston where she lives. And that was in existence when she was born as a human. So it kind of links her past to the current present. But yeah, I tried to get it fairly early in my process, because then that helps build what's going on and where it's going on.
Nice. Sorry, Alaina, are you okay? Did you manage to reconnect?
Yeah, I saw the little spinning wheel there for a while, and I didn't want to touch anything, but then I couldn't unmute myself. So Can I have the question again? Where does it come in the
Yeah, of
process?
course, of course. Whereabouts in the process does your setting and thereby a huge chunk of world building, like how early on in the process are you thinking of setting, or are you a person who gets there later, or is it character first? Like where does it land?
Yeah, there's not an easy answer, I guess. For my first book, for my debut novel in the state park, I always start with character first, and I knew I wanted to write the one character, the park ranger. And I was actually hiking with my partner a few years ago in Pfeiffer Big Sur State Park in California. And if you've never been there, there's a waterfall that goes in the ocean. It's amazing. But as we were walking, I said, I have this idea for a book, and I want to write a female park ranger. And I spent a lot of time in the park that I wrote about back when I was, younger in college, and for about a decade, I was there off and on, and I knew it well enough that I thought I could place everything there. But so that one, it came, fairly early. My second one, yeah, I mean, I always start with the characters first, and then, the world comes after, I guess. But, it takes place, mine are all contemporary romances, so they take place in the real world, and it takes place in a restaurant in New York. And I've been there, to New York a few times, and, feel like I know it enough to write it. So, yeah, I guess character and then setting comes for me.
Nice. It's funny. I think almost everything I've ever written has been set in Ottawa, and 90% of that is because I just don't trust myself to get the details right somewhere else. So yeah, I hear what you're saying. Like you've gone to New York enough, you're like, okay, now I could write something here. And that's an experience I hear from a lot of authors. Like when they travel, like, ooh, I've been here.
Right. And I do want to say I am in awe of you authors who build these other worlds, because I don't know how you do it. And you only have so many, pages in a book to get everything in. And I feel like maybe it's just, my tendency to just want to jump right in. I think that's part of the reason is my impatience to set things in the real world, because I don't want to have to stop. And like you were saying, you have to think about the history of vampires, or, if you're writing werewolves, or there's so much that goes into all of those, but then you are creating so much more. And even DC creating an entire city of his own. I don't know how you all do it. I'm in awe.
And how about you, Brey? Where does your setting sort of hit on the list of to do?
I think a little bit like Sandra, I start with what if. What if gods walked among us? And then setting comes into it, and characters pretty much right at the same time. With Chosen, it was, what if we can't inhabit this planet anymore? We can't all leave. So what happens then? So I tend to take the what if situation and then build from there. So like with Chosen, that ended up being, kind of a destroyed planet, dystopian situation. And then who were my people in it? I got lucky with that because it was a dream. From beginning to end, my characters, the setting, everything was in my dream. And I woke up and didn't like the ending, so I went back to sleep and changed. So that was, kind of a one-off. I mean, changing course was similar, but yeah, I think for me, it always starts with the question, because I like to play with huge questions that then boil down to just two people dealing with stuff.
Right. I am going to bounce back to Alaina because she mentioned restaurant, and now it occurs to me, we talk about world building, we tend to talk about it very large, and something she said struck me. You're setting something in a restaurant, so obviously like food is going to play into it. And it occurred to me that all of you have set your stories in very interesting places from a cuisine point of view. And I mean, if we're talking vampires, then I mean, how do you describe that whole thing? But I wondered, like, when you're like, what about these little minutiae? And I mean, it doesn't have to be food, but like, what are the little tiniest details that have sort of captured your attention? And I'm going to bounce it back to Alaina first, just because food sprang to mind there, and having a whole book set in a restaurant, I'm imagining it's taking a center stage.
It does. It's a book about a chef in a fine dining restaurant, and she finds out that a reality TV show is coming in to help solve their problems, and she's only given, a matter of like 2 days notice. And I base almost the entire book in the restaurant, so and mainly in the kitchen. So it was hard, to have such a finite set with, but it was fun. And of course, food is, a big focus, because I used to be a chef and I love, traveling and trying foods everywhere. And it does play a part in it, but I didn't want to go overboard with it. But there's some food.
What about you, DC? It was what minutia or what tiny little thing that you brought into the book that maybe you weren't even expecting, but became a piece of your world building?
Part of the Tinker Creek book that wound up not making it into the final version was a lengthy description of a restaurant that the aunt of one of the characters owns and runs in an old Victorian building in St. Michael's Harbor. And she has her office in her small apartment in the Widow's Watch part of the building, and the rest of the building is basically a series of kitchens and tables, and it's a tremendously interesting Belle Epoque decorated sort of place. And I like to cook, I like food, and I went all out on the detail of this place, but because it was so good that I think a lot of people said they felt like they thought they'd eaten there at some point. They'd like to eat there soon. But that is, it also helped make the book way too long. So a bunch of that material is now resting in my computer to be used somewhere else. Nothing is wasted. But I think that having those sorts of details of what things smell like, the sounds when you arrive in the restaurant, and the sounds when you open the door, that rush of sound that comes at you, the clinking of the table, the cutlery, and the noises of people talking, and then what things smell like. And then, especially in a fine dining situation, if you're going through the restaurant, the odors are going to change. You'll smell different things, and how that kind of clues into what they're cooking, what might be on the menu, what you might be eating. All that plays in. It's fun. I love writing. A guy that say I love writing novels. I love them.
How about you, Sandra? Has there been a moment, a surprise, or a little tiny piece that you didn't think you'd have to deal with, but you're like, oh, this is actually important?
Yeah, it's interesting, because I had some fight scenes in each of the novellas that had, it's a vampire, there's going to be a certain amount of fighting. And I needed them to kind of be sort of dark, dank places, because I didn't want necessarily other people finding out, or at least not finding out too soon. So I kind of had to explore, and one of the ones that really grabbed my attention, and I didn't even realize at the time, even though I grew up in Boston, is that there are some tunnels from the train system that were just blocked off. They just kind of gave up on this train station, and it was right under, it actually exists right under Boston City Hall. And it just suddenly became just the most fascinating place to set one of these fight scenes in. And just digging in the articles and seeing the pictures of this station that I think stopped being used in the 60s when they built the monstrosity that is the Boston City Hall. Go look at a picture for it and you'll see what I mean. It's hideous, okay. But whatever, they built it. So yeah, it was just so much fun to just dig in and the articles that you could find on it and things that were going on and whatnot. So that was a whole lot of fun.
Nice. How about you, Brey? What was something that surprised you or grabbed you, or a tiny detail that you weren't expecting?
I think I tend to write about places I can really Google and research. So I pay really close attention to minutia like travel time. Like in LA, it's all traffic. So, you know, if you need to get somewhere, it's going to be like 2 hours. Wherever you need to go, at least give it 2 hours. Whereas, you know, in Venice, there are no cars. So you need to be able to boat everywhere and make sure that, you know, you can either walk through the bridges, which are a maze, or, you know, or which boat to catch to what part of the island. But I think for me, what I had to research the most that I hadn't really planned on was in Chosen. They go to the Cheyenne Mountain underground where the president of the US will go if there's ever an attack or whatever. And this is where my characters end up. I had to research that. And it's not an easy thing to research because it's very secret. So it took me a long time to kind of figure out. So from the beginning of the tunnel to the main door is going to take you this long, and you have to take a little train. And then once you're inside, there's this many buildings and they're 3 stories each. And so that was kind of minutia that I had to wrap my head around. Not that anybody else in the world would care, but it mattered to me. But same thing like New York in Spinning Tales, you know, she finds a fairy tale land outside her back door in this little cabin that's on top of an apartment building, a cottage that's on top of an apartment building. Now that exists. I found that in a newspaper article that was for sale, this little cottage on top of an apartment building. So I had to write about it, and obviously it has a back door that leads to another world entirely. But how do you get to the apartment building? And how many subways do you have to take? And that kind of minutia I don't always plan on. So I end up thinking, no, I have to get this right, even though nobody cares. But it's like turning on Bourbon Street, right? Somebody's gonna care.
Yeah, that's lovely. I can't believe it. We're actually 5 minutes away from the end. Thank you all. You were all so wonderful. Before we go, I will remind everybody that there will be a WebStar sale all weekend on some of the backlist ebook titles by all the authors featured throughout the bookathon. And that sale runs throughout midnight Eastern today, wherever today is for you. We're from like 5 different countries, I think, on this call. So and we have just enough time. I will get each of you to tell us a little bit about what's coming next for you. And if you have anything you'd like to tease, and I'll start with you, Brey.
Okay. Well, Lines of Love just came out in December, and Vision of Virtue just came out in September. So those are quite new releases. Next up, I'm working on Amish vampires. So we're going to see how that goes.
Awesome. How about you, DC?
I have already finished, and it's in the queue someplace. A historical novel set in World War II. Well, it's a contemporary novel with a historical chunk of it. The historical part of it is told as a story within a story about 2 women who fall in love during World War II, where one is a flyer for the Air Force program to get women to fly planes to the WASP program, and not a WASP, I forgot. Wow, maybe that was right. That program anyway, and a singer in a USO band, and the contemporary part is the effort it takes to get that story told and published and brought to light because it's been buried for a long time. So you have two separate trails of storytelling in the book. And I'm hoping that it progresses from there.
That sounds lovely. I love stories that mention that we're here and we've always been here. Yeah, absolutely. How about you, Sandra? What's up next?
So the 3rd Jade Murphy book comes out in February. That's Dark Truths. But what I'm working on right now is going back with the what ifs. What if necromancers were real and legally licensed? So that's the story that I'm working on right now.
Awesome. And last but not least, Alaina, where are you taking us next?
Well, I never did show my first book. This is the
Right.
first book. I just love the cover. I think the cover artist did such a great job. My second book is called Off the Menu, and it'll be out March 1st. I'm excited about this one. It's different in tone and almost in every way than the book I just wrote. And then come, I think November, I think it's scheduled. I have a third book called All Things Beautiful, and it takes place in New York, and it takes place in a fine art atelier where oil painting is taught in the style of the old masters. And it's a student teacher kind of romance, but not what you think. So I'll tease it that way.
Nice. Thank you all again. And thank you to everyone who hopped in and asked questions and comments. I loved watching the chat screen scroll by. I tried to keep an eye on it, but I appreciate you so much for being so involved. Stick around. Oh, great. I was about to tell you what was next, and my computer just shut down every window. I actually can't even see what's going on Zoom right now. So I have nothing but a blank screen. Please stick around. I believe it's a reading that is next. I hope that's correct. I'm so sorry if it's not. And thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you, Nathan.
Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.